invite people to hop on the queue. So this is what they call the longest minute in showbiz, out of radio. All righty.
Q&A session started. This conference is being recorded.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so very much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule to join us for our national TPP call. Tonight, we're going to be talking about mystery meat, dead dolphins, why we still must resist the WTO. Our speakers that are going to be joining us tonight are Deborah James, Director of International Programs, the Center for Economic Policy, Emilianne Slaydon, TPP Media March, Elizabeth Warren, Communications Director, Campaign Outreach, People Demanding Action, Dr. Margaret Flowers, Campaign Coordinator, Popular Resistance, Gabriela Delgado, Puranos contra el TPP and Las Zonas, and Miguel Chiri, Puranos contra el TPP and Las Zonas. I studied French, so that's about as good as I do when I'm not speaking French. But I said it with a lot of enthusiasm. Now, I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the Executive Director of People Demanding Action, and I'm going to go over the call norms right now. All audio is on the phone, so you must call in, and if you are in the meeting room host will put the call-in number and the PIN in the chat room. Do not turn on your video camera, and the reason we don't use video is some of our folks have very, very, very low bandwidth, and we found that if we run the video cameras, then they really have a hard time in the meeting room. So no video cameras, because we're getting more and more people in the meeting room. Now, all calls are recorded, and at the end of the call, I will be posting the call link on our website. It will be available in our Facebook group. When we use Q&A mode, or we are using Q&A mode to eliminate background noise so that we get a really good recording, and when we're ready for Q&A, I will invite you to press *6, and then that will add you to the queue. And then one last thing, we ask everybody in the chat room to keep your discussions professional and on topic. As I mentioned, all our audio is phone only, and the dial-in number is on the screen, 605-562-3140, and the access code for guests is 951146. If you are a speaker, you were sent a different access code, so whatever access code you were sent, that is the appropriate one for you to use. There is obviously a chat room over on the left-hand side, and I see people are burning it up. And there is a share button at the bottom right, directly below the list of people who are currently in the meeting room. You can use the share button and download the PowerPoint that I'm using this evening and or any past PowerPoints. After the call, you can click the link below, and it changes every week, and you will be able to download all the call materials from tonight. I'm going to give you a really quick advocacy update. we sent 19,458 emails directly into the United States Senate and the House opposing the TPP. That advocacy alert is going to remain open. So if you have not had a chance to email your members of Congress and tell them how much you think this deal stinks and is totally rotten, please feel free to do so. We have had 25 people send a letter to the editor. Now it's my favorite part where I get to introduce all the people who make it possible for us to have this call. I am just one of the voices that you hear. There are a host of people that make this possible. Tom Hocking is on the line. He's our technical advisor, our Facebook page manager. He's with Move On Pennsylvania. He will be handling pre and or post and or even during call technical questions. Harriet Haywood has joined us. She is the call co-organizer. She is the Florida state leader for People Demanding Action. I have a company called Data Access. Sorry, I sort of lapsed into company mode there for a sec. Also on the call planning team is Mara Cohen. Mara works with me on PDA and mass criminalization. She's the global climate convergence leader in Illinois, and Mara has just started taking on new duties. She has started helping us organize and arrange people to interview on PDA Radio for Agitator Radio, which is a program all about mass criminalization. Lisa Oldendorf from Move On New York is also an integral member of our call planning team. She is one of your chat hosts. Also, Linda Brewster is with us tonight. Linda is a Move On regional organizer from Washington State, also on the call planning team. And we are going to bring up Emilianne Slaydon, also a member of the call planning team, but most people know Emilianne as the lady that's responsible for our Twitter storms. So, Emilianne, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So next slide, please. So this might be repetitive for people that are on our call every week, but for anyone new on the call, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Twitter storms. Twitter storms are when we all gather on Tuesday evenings nationwide, and we tweet all at the same time, and the common hashtag is hashtag StopTPP. That's our call to action. So this week we have our storm is reflective of our call this evening. This is the storm invite. Next slide, please. I'll show you how to participate in a Twitter storm. So seriously, it's the most fun and easiest way to raise awareness to stop TPP. We had over 4,000 people click this link, tiny.cc/TPP Media March, last Tuesday. That's only on laptop and desktop computers. So the people that access this link from cell phones and iPads are even over 4,000 people. So we're seeing a pretty big success here. And we really want to grow our movement, so I can't stress enough, so please join us on Tuesdays. So here's what you do. You see the dolphin with the circle, just go to the PDA website, see this picture, click and drag that to your desktop, and then share that picture, post it on Facebook or tweet it out. So that will help invite new people and introduce them to our Twitter storm. And then you see below the picture all of these tweets. These tweets all contain calls to action and article links from our TPP partners to help educate new people. There's lots of information there for people new to TPP. It's very, very important to get this information out every Tuesday. So first, you just help us invite people, and then next slide, please. You just copy and paste each tweet to Twitter and tweet it, just like there. It's so easy. Next slide, please. If you don't like to copy and paste, no problem. Here is the TPP Media March profile on Twitter. You can just go there. You can follow if you like. But next slide, please. The most important thing is to retweet all of the storm tweets. So you can see, just press retweet. It's very, very simple. And that means you have participated in our Twitter storm. Next slide, please. So when we storm together, we can stop TPP. We have grown this movement phenomenally through TPP Tuesday, and I can't tell you how much fun it is to do this. It's super easy. You can even pre-program your tweets and tweet decks. That's an advanced lesson for another time, perhaps. Or you can email me separately, and I'll help you with that. Thank you so much. I'll see you on Tuesday on Twitter. Take care.
Well, thank you very much, Emilianne. Next up, I'm going to bring on Celeste Drake. Celeste Drake is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist from the AFL-CIO. Celeste is going to give us a report on the State of the Union and then also on the USITC TTIP hearing. So, Celeste, take it away.
Thanks very much. So I'll start with the ITC. So for folks who don't know, the International Trade Commission is a semi-independent organization of the federal government, and they have a quasi-judicial function. So when people are claiming that a trade rule has been broken, for instance, dumping, countervailing duties, not following the rules on intellectual property, other things, they often will take the case to the ITC. The ITC will hold a hearing, make a determination, decide whether tariffs should be imposed. They also have the responsibility of writing reports on things that the United States is planning to do on trade and what are the likely outcomes. So for every trade agreement, from NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, to the more recent Korea Free Trade Agreement, the ITC did a report. And it has a problem that it's almost always over-optimistic, and it undercounts things like loss of investment, currency exchange rates, the loss of social welfare due to regulations being weakened, et cetera, et cetera. So it had over 60 people request to testify on the ITC. They had to expand from 1 day to 3 days of hearings. I testified along with 3 other people from labor, the National Farmers Union, and then Doctors Without Borders, and unfortunately most of the rest were business interests. But we really emphasized that the ITC needs to update what it's doing. It needs to count correctly. There was a recent study by Tufts University that uses a different model than the ITC, and it says that the TPP is going to actually be negative for all 12 countries and probably the worst for the United States, which will lose almost 500,000 jobs and almost 1.5% of income, of the national income that currently goes to labor, will switch and go to capital. And obviously that's one of our biggest complaints, is that these deals, of course, are good for somebody. Otherwise, there wouldn't be an interest in doing them. It's just business. So the ITC, if you'd like to comment, you can do that online. They are taking comments until February 15th. They are going to produce a report that's due May 18th. Also this week, interestingly, the president gave his State of the Union very early this year. Generally, I thought it was a pretty good speech. He devoted less than half a minute to the TPP. And we think that's because there continues to be a fight about the president wants it voted on as early as possible. Members of Congress are quite worried about voting on it before the election and how that will impact, for instance, things like the Republicans wanting to keep the Senate in their control. So we should not mistake the fact that there's this debate as business letting up or weakening their support. They are doubling down on their support. And we are going to have a strong, long campaign against the TPP, even though we don't know yet exactly when it will come for a vote. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Celeste. And yes, I remember watching the State of the Union and then seeing that box on the side for TPP, and it went by so fast that if you sneezed, you would have missed it. All right. Next up is Elizabeth Warren, and that's Elizabeth Warren of People Demanding Action, not Senator Elizabeth Warren. And she's going to be talking about some of the special work that she's been doing. So for our standbys who've been on the call, Liz is going to update us on her new project. So Liz, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Andrea. And also apologies to Gabriela, who is having trouble getting audio. We will have a link to listen to the call afterwards, and I think Harriet and everybody will share it with you. I am here to talk about the Globalization Train the Trainer program that we are working on with content supplied by our partners at the AFL-CIO. So thank you, Celeste, and everyone at the AFL-CIO for creating this great content as part of your Common Sense Economics program. What we've done was taken about a 3-hour in-person training and consolidated most of those elements into a 90-minute online training for trainers that walks you through it. We are going to give you 2 dates to sign up. You can do it either Monday, the 25th at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, or Wednesday, the 27th of January at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. And what we're asking everyone to do, who signs up for the training, you're actually going to be our beta testers, if you will. Most of you folks have been working on this issue for some time. You've been leaders in your communities, within your unions, within your organizations, within various functions that you've taken on. And we are hoping that you will kind of set the example and set the standard, and also evaluate for us the quality of the online training, because what we aim to do after we do these 2 trainings is actually create a do-it-yourself version for leaders that they can actually, upload or download. Download and use it themselves. And so we'll sync up the audio and that sort of thing, and we'll actually be fine-tuning and maybe, taking some things out, putting some things in. So we will want you to tell us what you think of our efforts on these first 2 inaugural trainings. Once you have completed these trainings, then what we're asking you to do is conduct an in-person training in your community. Again, many of you have, if you're a member of a union or you're a Move On member or you work with Citizens Trade Campaign or Sierra Club or any number of organizations, you've probably been to trainings. You know the drill. You'll be getting a packet with content. There'll be exercises, questions, all that sort of thing, downloads, handouts. And we will ask you to register a training at some sort of public facility, either a library, a union hall, a church, a school, or even a private home if you can find one large enough to host your group. And do that sometime between January 28th and February 8th. As you all know, and others will talk about, the President's expected to sign TPP in New Zealand on the 4th of February. There's going to be a lot of action happening starting that day and going on up through the middle of the month when the Congressional Recess Week happens. So after the trainings in person, we're going to ask folks to then participate in events the week of the Congressional Recess, which would be the 15th to the 19th of February. So we're hoping that training on, that week between the 28th and the 8th, you would be actually signing up your attendees to mobilize and either do a letter drop or another action depending on the district. And we'll be keeping everybody up to speed on this depending on the district in which you live. Our partners at Citizens Trade Campaign, Public Citizen, and other allies will be targeting specific representatives in Congress for different kinds of actions. We at People Demanding Action will be creating a special TPP letter drop. And we will be, having a letter that we'll share online. You can just print it out. You can personalize it to your representative. And there you go. Now I'd like to, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask me your questions. I will be happy to answer them. I don't know how much time I have, but Andrea will tell me.
Well, let's take only about maybe 5 minutes. If you do have a question, press *6 on your phone, and that will put you in the queue. We'll see you, and then you'll be able to ask your question of Liz. All right. Our first caller at 815, I believe it is. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. So are we going to be sent information on this then this week or something if we want to join the educational experience?
Yes, you will. You'll actually, if you have registered your email when you registered for this call, we will send you an invitation to sign up. There's also a link on the slide in the PowerPoint, so you can either directly link from this PowerPoint if you download it, or you can wait for an email from us. Either way.
Okay.
Yes, you will get
I'll wait for an email.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Mark, your line's open.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, Mark.
Well, hi. Well, this is. I'm sure you'll agree with this. Doing that at our local congressional office. At our
yes.
Doing that kind of a meeting at our local congressional office.
Exactly. Yes. If you can do once you've trained folks, yes, that recess week. What we actually are asking you to do is if you can set up a meeting with your representative, depending on who the representative is, either thank that person for their position if they're with us. If they're not with us, work with allies to determine the appropriate action. If you're not acquainted with your rep or haven't had a lot of contact, you can simply do a letter drop. We'll have a prepared letter for you. So whatever works for you.
Well, please send us information via email and a list of who to invite. That would be helpful if you have a large database of people.
Now, you're asking who to invite to your training or who to invite to your recess week action, or both?
Well, both. Both. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll explain this a little more as we go. But for the events, and maybe I should back up for just a second, Andrea. I'll take about a minute to just explain. If you post an event, and we'll share information on how to do that once you've taken the trainer training. So this is actually a 3-step process. Once you've taken the trainer's training, you will be posting an event, and that event will be public, and we will help you promote it. So you can promote it on social media. There's going to be links and information for you to share via email, Facebook, et cetera, to share with people you know to attend, because you're going to be doing local action. So this is going to be up to you to recruit, but we're going to help you do it. As far as the recess week actions, you can have one person or a handful, depending, again, if you're going to meet with your representative. Usually small groups work well. If it's a representative who's been targeted because that person is not with us, we'll put you in touch with allies who may be planning a rally or something else.
Thank you.
Sure.
Harold, go ahead.
Hi, this is Harold in Portland, Oregon. I just have a quick question. I was trying to, on this PowerPoint, the one where it says Stop TPP event, February 4th, February 10th, I'm not able to actually click on those links. They're not functioning as links.
That's correct, Harold. In this meeting room, the links are not live. So what I'm doing is the link for the training, which is really the very first one, that's already in the chat room, and all the other links are on that one page. So if you go to that one page, all the other items, they will be there too.
Which page are you talking about going to?
The one preceding this. And also, just one thing, Harold, too, when you get a copy of the PowerPoint, you can actually just highlight with your cursor and copy and paste into your browser one of those links. They're just not live in the meeting room. We don't want
Okay, that's fine. No problem. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. You're welcome. Christopher.
Yes. Hi, Andrea. My question is, can you send me to my email how to register for the training?
Yes.
We can.
And
we're going to email that to everybody. Yes.
Everyone on the call will get an email with a link to register.
Oh, fantastic. I'm very excited about the training.
Thank you, Christopher. And our last question, Wendy.
Thank you very much. I was offering a suggestion that I know Margaret has lists of people that have signed up with her in people's districts and in their states, as well as offering that we can contact our local Sierra clubs, and if 350.org comes on board too, we can organize through their lists, and that would be helpful to the person who needed to know who to invite. Check.
Great suggestion, Wendy, and thank you. Yes, we are encouraging everyone. And again, if you have not led a training before, attended one, wait and sign up for one. We would hope that the folks that would actually lead trainings are people who maybe been community organizers for a while. So what we'd encourage folks to do is if you've led events or led training, sign up to be a trainer. If you haven't, then hang on for a little bit and look for one in your community, because we've got a lot of people on this call, so we're hoping that we will have most of the communities covered through the folks that join this call and our allies that Wendy just mentioned. In any event, if you have any questions, you can also email us at tpp@peopledemandingaction.org, and I think somebody will probably put that in the chat for me, or I will when I'm finished.
All righty. Thank you very much, Liz. And now for the fastest news commentary on what is going on with the TPP and these terrible trade deals, Adam Weissman. Adam is with Trade Justice and Global Justice for Animals and the Environment. He is on the call planning team. Adam recruits speakers, and Adam follows events, news stories, and actions. So, Adam, here's your first slide.
Great. And sorry, everyone, for some of the conversions issues with the slides. All of the slides that are posted here will be online and available, and are online and available if you go to tradejustice.net/news. You'll also, in addition to my slides there, you'll find some additional handouts, bullet points, and links from our speaker later in the call, Deborah James. So if you go to tradejustice.net/news, you can see a less mucked up version of these slides. The conversion is sometimes challenging. So going on to our news stories, there's a new analysis, well, not that new, pretty new analysis from the Sierra Club countering the Obama administration's argument that TPP will be beneficial to wildlife and endangered species, saying that in fact just the opposite is true, that sharks, tigers, and elephants are among the species at risk under TPP. The Philip Morris ISDS case that many of us have heard of, that was popularized through the Last Week Tonight show with on HBO, was actually thrown out. However, the ramifications of that case are still being felt in some of the weaker, some of the partial carve-out tobacco language that made it into TPP, into the final text, though certainly not as much as we would have liked, as groups like the groups like CPAS have argued that this is actually not as strong a protection as we would have wanted. The TPP trade deal, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, is saying may be good for Philadelphia, but will in fact be disastrous for Pittsburgh and other strong manufacturing cities in the United States. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs has released a new report saying that TPP will be disastrous for Latin America. Next slide, please. And so while these links are not active in the PowerPoint, when you go to the news page, these are all actual links that you can read and read these stories and share them. It's a PDF that's easy for downloading and sharing. Business groups continue to endorse TPP. We heard last week about how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce finally came out in support of TPP. The Canadian Liberal Party still has not taken a completely clear position on TPP. The World Bank is arguing that TPP will benefit Vietnam, Japan, and Malaysia the most of the TPP countries. There's another story about an issue we heard a lot about last week, the Trans-Canada NAFTA suit, which is making the case about why ISDS is so dangerous for the environment, investor-state dispute settlement. The next slide, please. Okay, Malaysia apparently is the one TPP country that can opt out after the fact. Another story about Pittsburgh. and how TPP will be bad news for Pittsburgh, of a kind that Pittsburgh has felt before with these outsourcing, manufacturing, killing trade deals. The White House is putting an aggressive push, despite its 28 seconds at the State of the Union. The White House continues to make an aggressive push towards Congress to move a TPP vote as fast as possible. There's still a lot of wrangling on TPP in Malaysia, where different parties are pushing aggressively on different sides of that issue. There's a big controversy in New Zealand about the TPP signing date. Apparently, that date lines up very closely with the date when indigenous New Zealanders signed a treaty with Great Britain, which the indigenous people argue they did not cede their sovereignty. And they feel that, in fact, TPP is an attack on indigenous sovereignty, and so to have this signing date very close to the date of that treaty signing was an insult to New Zealand indigenous people. More Malaysian news. And next slide, please. Okay, so as we'll be hearing later in the call, opposition to TPP is rising in Latin America. There's growing opposition in Chile. The U.S. Grains Council, which has a vested interest in these free trade agreements, not only because of selling grain to other countries for food, but because selling grain helps export the model of industrial agriculture. Exporting grain helps to build factory farm agriculture, which is, of course, based around grain-fed livestock. So the U.S. Grains Council is not so certain that TPP will be the successful deal they hope it will be, which is, of course, good news for us. Next slide. Okay, Rosa DeLauro, who some of you heard speak on a national TPP conference call last Wednesday, also earlier in the week held a press conference with allies in Congress and in civil society denouncing TPP in advance of the State of the Union address. The chair of the House Ways and Means Committee is not sure that things are smooth sailing yet with TPP. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, one of the strongest leaders in Congress against these free trade deals consistently, is preparing a new salvo in the fight against TPP. We have additional confirmation of the New Zealand signing coming up for TPP in an article in the New Zealand Herald. Next slide. Okay, Malaysia's Halal Food Development Department just got a certification signed for basically allowing for certified halal export under TPP. Again, still another story about Canada's non-committal stance on TPP under the Liberals. A couple important opinion stories, one on how TPP will negatively impact the environment. Another, a very interesting piece from Senator Jesse Hamilton of New York, someone I hope we can get on one of these calls fairly soon, who is pushing a letter for New York State senators against the TPP, which will be released sometime soon, and who is saying that TPP, looking at some of the ISDS cases, TPP could be devastating for his own Brooklyn community. From the right, there's a piece in WND about how TPP means executive overreach by Curtis Ellis at the American Jobs Alliance. Next slide. Okay, now last few stories. There's are concerns that TPP could undermine a campaign to stop a proposed coal mine on Cheyenne land in Montana. A new piece by Joseph Stiglitz on how the devastating effects of TPP in the Bangkok Post. A video interview with Tom Hartman from the Big Picture on RT. Human Rights Watch has a new Q&A on TPP talking about how TPP is detrimental to human rights. Next slide, please. Okay, now moving on to some events this week. On Tuesday, January 19th in New York City, and we'll see what we can do about live streaming and recording this event for people not in the New York area. There'll be a very interesting panel called What Effect Will the Trans-Pacific Partnership Have on Domestic and International Climate Change Action? Featuring Ben Beachy from the Sierra Club, Lise Johnson of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and a bunch of other folks. This Wednesday, I'll be doing a radio interview at 10 a.m. on Internet Radio with Allison Rose Levy on Connect the Dots Radio, and there's a link that you can use to listen if you go to the website. And finally, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how it will affect New York and why we should stop it, is a panel discussion coming up this Thursday in Queens, and that event will be live streamed at stopmotionsolo.tv. I'll post that link in the live stream for those of you who actually, that's cut off from the chat box, so I guess I'll post it for everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, and for those of you who want to get more involved in this work and in helping to promote these great conference calls and helping us to get this information out, we have a national TPP team outreach and publicity committee. If you go to tradejustice.net/117poll, you can let us know when you are available to participate in the meetings for this committee and get involved in the work of helping to build the audience from these calls from the hundreds into the thousands. Deadline is tomorrow at 1 o'clock for those of you who'd like to fill out that poll. Again, that's tradejustice.net/117poll. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Adam. We're going to do a very, very quick question and answer with Adam and Celeste. If you have a question, star 6. I'm only going to take about 2. So star 6 if you've got a question for Emilianne, Celeste, or Adam. You guys were brilliant. I've got one question. Bonnie.
Yes, hi. I recognize all the reasons why people are so opposed to the TPP, but I hear very little about the effect this will have on both our sovereignty and especially the TISA, what that will do to actually our democracy and our republic.
Are you directing that to? All right.
Not
Celeste.
in particular.
All righty. Celeste, do you want to grab that first?
Sure. I would just say most of us that are on the call planning team and working on this agree with you 100%. The TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, it's got about 50 countries in it. And the idea is to make rules for trade and services, which, if folks think about it, that means it doesn't deal with traditional trade issues at all, no quota, no tariff. It's only about laws, rules, and regulations. That is part of this. It's part of the neoliberal trade model, the corporate trade model. And really what we're hoping to accomplish through all of these calls in this education is that folks see the links. The TPP isn't a standalone thing to fight. It's part of the broader fight about TPP, TISA, and, of course, TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So anyone that is interested in these others, we, of course, are thinking about doing calls focusing on the TISA and all of those things, but we're also trying to make sure that folks are focused on what's immediately in front of us now, which is, of course, the TPP. Thanks.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you very much. We now have 2 guests that are joining us from Peru. It looks as though Gabriela, Adam is going to need to read her statements from Facebook. She isn't able to join the call. And I know that Miguel is also here in the room. Miguel, have you been able to join the call? I will. Miguel, press star 6. Or either just let me know. Adam is asking. Adam is working on getting everything in sync with Gabriela. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward to Dr. Margaret Flowers because I know Dr. Flowers is on the phone. Dr. Margaret Flowers is a real doctor. She's a pediatrician and co-chair of the Maryland chapter of Physicians for a National Health Program. Some people know the organization by its initials, PNHP. Margaret is also co-director of Popular Resistance, It's Our Economy, co-organizer of Flush the TPP. She was the co-organizer of the November Fall Rising Days of Action in D.C. So we put in the websites of a number of the organizations that we listed, and there is also the Democratize the Media Forces of Greed Radio. So, Margaret, welcome, and thank you so very much for joining us and letting us know what you're working on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
You are loud and clear.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone, for being on the call tonight. It's so important that we keep our momentum going this year because this is the year we're going to stop the TPP. I won't take a long time tonight. I want to focus on the upcoming actions in February. This is really taking off and getting some great momentum. Since this picture was taken that you see on the screen, we've had more cities join in with action, so it's really growing. Basically, February 4th is the earliest day that President Obama can sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there's expected to be a signing in Auckland, New Zealand. Now, February 4th is actually, because they are a day ahead of us, February 4th is February 3rd here. So what we decided to do today is that for the Washington, D.C. action, which is going to take place in front of the White House, and we're bringing large banners and large photographs and lots of great things down there, props and things for visuals. We're going to do that on the afternoon of February 3rd at 12 noon, hoping that people in D.C. will be able to join us at lunchtime. We'd love to have a strong turnout. We'd love to have labor there, Celeste, with all of your signs as well. Really hoping that we can capture some great media images right before he signs the agreement that will then be the images that are out there and help to really also jumpstart the wave of actions that's going to happen the next day on February 4th. So if you're in the D.C. area, please come down. If you're not, look and see if there's an action where your city is. If you don't have an action, please plan one. It doesn't take that many people to organize this. Mara Cohen, who some of you may remember, is willing to and is actually working with groups in various cities to plan actions. She'll help you out with your planning, with creating Facebook pages, with media. We will also help to promote your action. So if you think you can get a few friends together and plan something, get in touch with us. You can contact me at info@popularresistance.org. And Mara is Mara, M-A-R-A, Jai, J-A-I, or J, I guess she says, Mara J. So it's M-A-R-A-J-A-I 51 @gmail.com. But you can always just reach us through the Flush the TPP website if that's too complicated. Now, the members of Congress are going to be in their home districts shortly after that during President's Week, February 14th to 21st. I know that lots of people are already planning actions at their member of Congress's offices during that time. We encourage that as well, and also think that the February 4th actions can be a great place to publicize if you're doing any kind of a rally outside of your Congress member's office. So let's make this big, and please get in touch with us if you're willing to put something together. Next, I want to go to the next slide. Just the only other thing is, remember, we do the weekly TPP resistance organizing calls. Everyone is welcome to join those calls. Those are every Wednesday, so the next one is Wednesday, January 20th at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. We use the Interoccupy Maestro technology, so you do need to register. So please go to flushthetpp.org, and if you click on the news page, you'll see it's always the top post there so that you can register for that call. You can even register right up to the time of the call if you need to. And just want to give a shout out to our media mobilizers. They've been doing a really fantastic job of getting the word out, and it was awesome. If you didn't hear, after the State of the Union, Forbes Business reported that that free trade, or fair trade, not free trade, people were out in full force doing social media, ready to correct any misinformation. So it was good that with that effort, which was across the board. Labor was involved. Emilianne with the Media March was involved in that, and many others. Groups were out there tweeting. So strong work, and let's keep it up. And thanks very much.
And thank you very much, Margaret. Adam, are you ready?
I'm still working with them on trying to get their situation worked out. If we could push them back till after Deborah, that might be our best bet.
All righty. Let's see. We will do that Q&A later. Actually, does anybody have any questions for Margaret Flowers? We've already had question and answers with Liz Warren. So any questions for Margaret about upcoming events? *6 if you've got a question for Margaret. And I'll give you a couple of moments. *6 on your phone. That will put you on my queue. Mark, go ahead. Your line's open.
Oh, well, just please send us the file so that we can have a source for this. The file, the program, I forget the name of the program. I wish I had a photographic memory, but the program used, I'm sure it will have a lot of the details.
The PowerPoint?
Yeah, the power. Thank you. The PowerPoint.
All right.
Yeah.
The PowerPoint, we no longer email it. It's 40 megabytes. Most people cannot take a 40 megabyte file. So what we do is we upload the file to peopledemandingaction.org, go to downloads, go to TPP, and then there is a folder for every week's call. We put all the PowerPoints in that. People were unsubscribing from our email. They were having fits. They were going crazy. The PowerPoints are just too big. We no longer email them to people.
Okay, what's that URL address again, please?
peopledemandingaction.org. And then there'll be a item on the main menu, downloads, and then TPP, there's a folder, TPP and other trade deals, and every call has its own folder. So just find the date of the call you want, and you'll be able to download the PowerPoint, and we also have a link to the call recording. So you will always be able to get any one that you want.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you for that question. Mara.
Hi, this is Mara from the recruiting committee for the February 4th actions. And I just wanted to let people know that if they're thinking about trying to get something together, but they're not quite sure, they want to, they don't know what they're getting into, feel free to contact us because I'm really feeling like I can help people every step of the way. We've got resources of all kinds to make it pretty easy. And just shoot Margaret an email or me if you still have that address, and we'll walk through it together. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Mara. You're showing up as Butler County.
Okay. Maybe what I need to do is just email Mara. I have not for ever since Meat Cheap went over to a more advanced version of Adobe Flash Player. It won't download on my computer, so I am shut out from the chat room. I can't see the slides or anything. But I have an event coming up on the 3rd. I've been working with the Common Council here, and they're sponsoring an information session to tell people about the TPP. Now, it's going to be a pro and con because some people have a funny idea of what's balanced, that you mean both sides have to have exactly the same amount of time.
Is it kind of like a town hall? It almost sounds like.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, you can work directly with Mara, and then Mara will send me your contact information, and I will work with Meat Chief and figure out how we can get you back in the meeting room.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Last question, Bonnie.
Yes, hi. For Dr. Flowers, I've been so preoccupied for the last couple of months on the primary that I'm a little confused. I thought that Congress still had to do an up or down vote before the president could sign the TPP agreement. Where am I? What is the process?
Sure, thank you. And you're not the only one who's confused by this. So the president stated his intention to sign the agreement on November, was it November? I guess it was October 5th. The text of the agreement was released on November 5th. That in October 5th started a 90-day period that we had to basically review the text, and then he can sign it formally on February 4th. After that, there has to be what's called implementing legislation that puts it in place. That has to go through Congress. And that also has a 90-day timeline, but that begins when the president sends it to Congress, and he controls that. So when he thinks that it's a good time, that he has the votes, he'll send it to Congress, and that will start that 90-day clock ticking. So legally he can sign it, but it doesn't actually go into effect until Congress has that vote.
Thank you very much, Margaret. All right, Deborah, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Oh, welcome, Deborah. Deborah, I'm so delighted to have you join us. Deborah James is the Director of International Programs for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She has spent more than 15 years working on trade and democratic global governance, focusing on the WTO, the IMF, and U.S. policy toward Latin America. Prior to CEPR, she was the director of the WTO program at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch and Global Economy Director of Global Exchange. Deborah has authored numerous scholarly articles and made regular appearances on both English and Spanish news programs to shed light on the impact of corporate globalization. Deborah graduated cum laude in psychology and women's studies from the University of California at San Diego and holds a master's in international policy and planning from George Washington University. Deborah, welcome. Now, because we had already sent the PowerPoint out and processed it for the meeting room, what I can do is I can upload it to all of the places where we store our assets, but we weren't able to include anything for you. So please go ahead and just make your presentation for us.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much to everyone who does all the hard work of putting this call together. I'm going to talk today about the World Trade Organization, and I agree with Celeste's earlier point that we always want to focus on the main issue at hand, which we know now is the TPP. But Adam asked me to join particularly because there was just a ministerial meeting of the WTO in December in Nairobi, Kenya, and so it's good to have an updated understanding also of the global picture. So I'm going to talk about the WTO, three different aspects that I was asked to cover. So we'll talk first about the history, just to understand how it came into being and what the different aspects of it are. And then I will discuss what's the current situation in the negotiations. That's sort of like the legislative branch of the WTO. And then also a quick review of some of the cases that are being adjudicated in the dispute settlement of the WTO. That's sort of the judicial branch. So there's three things I'd like you to keep in mind sort of throughout the discussion, because I'm going to go into some details about the history and things like that. But it's important, I think, always to have in mind that within the negotiations, it's mostly a fight between developed and developing countries. So there's various different blocks that have proposals or that work on different issues, but that's sort of a general dynamic within the negotiations. Also, that civil society groups have bridged that divide actually by acting in solidarity with the South, the groups from the North that are part of civil society working on WTO, but also by showing that the whole framework of the WTO is really about corporations writing the rules of the global economy against the public interest of all of us, actually. So workers, the environment, farmers, everybody. And also that even though you don't hear about the WTO very much in the media, it's very much an ongoing battle. There are regular meetings and negotiations, and that the entire expansion project, the idea of expanding the WTO would have concluded a long time ago if it were not actually because of the resistance, and that's resistance by the developing countries in the negotiations as well as by civil society. So to talk a little bit about the history, before the WTO, there was actually something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. It's called the GATT. And that was really something that came out of the aftermath of World War II. And it was, countries coming together to agree just to have rules on tariffs. So when we talk about how some issues are really trade issues, this was really about the trade issues. So the tariffs on goods, set up after World War II to prevent protectionism. And it's really important always to keep in mind that tariffs are really just taxes, and they're taxes that corporations pay for the privilege of being able to make a profit in the foreign country. So at the time, though, GATT always was part of the United Nations, so it did not have its own enforcement mechanisms. So there were many rounds of negotiations through the GATT where countries agreed to lower their tariffs further and further. At the time, it's also important to understand that during the 70s and 80s, there was actually an effort by developing countries to create something called the International Trade Organization, because they wanted actually to cover agriculture as well as non-agriculture goods, predominantly because developing countries, especially in Latin America, are actually more competitive in agriculture. And they wanted some of the subsidies that are there in the northern countries to be disciplined. But that effort never came to fruition. So instead, what we ended up with was the last round of GATT expansion was called the Uruguay round. And that's when the EU and US negotiated along with the other members to transform the GATT into the WTO. When it did that, it took itself out of the auspices of the United Nations. And basically, the idea was to take some of the same policies that institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had been imposing on developing countries and actually make them permanent, right? Because if you have what was called a structural adjustment policy where you have to cut tariffs and reduce subsidies and expose yourself to international competition, that's something that you can change if the economics change or if, say, you have a change in government. But if it's bound in an international treaty, of course, you give up any of that policymaking space. So they also then created a dispute settlement arm so that the rules can be enforced. And that is one of the problems that we have, obviously, with WTO. So at the time then when it was founded, it went way beyond just the GATT, the Agreement on Tariffs on Goods, and they actually incorporated a whole slew, about 24 other agreements on a whole bunch of issues, most of which we don't consider to be very trade-related. So they added a general agreement on trade and services, the GATT, G-A-T-S. They added another agreement called trade-related investment measures. They added an agreement on government procurement, agreements on intellectual property. That's the trade-related intellectual property agreement called TRIPS. And so they brought all of these issues in, and often how they do that is that the proponents, the countries that are proponents of the agreement will say, well, we just want to have like a study group about this issue. We think it might be, something to do with trade, and then they get it in as a study issue, and then they say, well, let's do some transparency reports. let's have agreement on transparency in this issue. And then, later on down the road, all of a sudden you realize that you have an agreement on something. And the way that they started off was with the study group and doing reports on it. So at the time, though, this was like a really big concession by the developing countries, because the developing countries don't actually have generally an offensive benefit in things like investment measures, trade and services, intellectual property. These are all things that are primarily advantageous to corporations that are based in the global north. So it was predominantly the EU and the U.S. agenda. And the trade-off was that finally the EU and the U.S. allowed agriculture to be brought under the auspices of the WTO, which they'd never allowed under the GATT. So the developing countries wanted agriculture in the WTO actually because they wanted the subsidies that are given out to farmers in the north to be disciplined, and they wanted the high tariffs that countries, particularly in Europe, have against imports of agricultural products to be reduced. And that is still a struggle. We'll get to that current status later. So the WTO began in 1995, and so it's 21 years old now. From right off the bat, many developing countries realized that they'd kind of gotten a bad deal and that many of the rules were not actually for their development, and actually they constrained a lot of the policy space that developing countries needed to use to have things like an industrialization policy to create jobs in manufacturing, that these agreements are fundamentally about, reducing your space to have a manufacturing policy. And a lot of the tools that indeed countries like ours in the U.S. that we used in favor of our development were actually, that developing countries were constrained from using many of these policies. So they started advocating for changes almost immediately to the existing WTO, and those changes were referred to as the implementation agenda. So it was problems that they had with implementation of the WTO rules. So that was called the implementation agenda. So right off the bat, they start making proposals, but these not going anywhere with these proposals. The WTO has, by charter, they have ministerials every 2 years. The ministerials are when the ministers get together, so the trade ministers around the world. Ours is called, as we know, the U.S. Trade Representative, but in most countries it's just called the Trade Minister. And they get together every 2 years, and they try to advance some big decisions at that time. So in 1997 was the first ministerial after the founding of WTO, and it was in Singapore, and they tried to actually add even more issues onto the WTO agenda. And these issues were trade facilitation, investment, government procurement, and competition policy. And what they did then is said, well, there's not agreement about negotiating them, but let's at least just have a study group, right, to talk about these 4 issues. In the next ministerial was in 1999 in Seattle. Many of you are probably more familiar with that than any other aspect of the WTO, so I won't describe it too much, but there was very massive civil society opposition to it, led by our friends in the labor movement, led by our friends in the grassroots movements, who put together very big opposition environmental movements to there being another a ministerial that would launch a new round of negotiations. That was the intent, and that ministerial fell apart when the African countries that had been so disrespected during the ministerial actually just walked out of the negotiations. So that was, there's a lot more to say about the Seattle ministerial, but certainly the 50,000 people in the streets from all walks of life certainly had a big impact on helping developing countries feel strong enough to resist the pressure from the U.S. and the EU to launch a new round. Well, what happened then is that there was the 9/11 attacks, and what happened at 9/11 was that there was a WTO ministerial scheduled for Doha in Qatar immediately afterwards. It just happened to be scheduled immediately afterwards, and so there was sort of a moment where everybody came together and said, oh, let's do something together that shows our international solidarity, and they basically agreed to launch a new round as showing something where the world was coming together in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But the deal that then got brokered was that the new round of expanding the WTO would actually focus on the developing countries' agenda of fixing some of the existing provisions, not just expanding the WTO, but actually fixing the current problems with it. And that is why the Doha round is actually referred to as a development round. And that was the development issues I mentioned earlier of the implementation agenda, which then got referred to as special and differential treatment. So that's one of the ways that it's referred to as the special and differential treatment, meaning how developing countries have more flexibilities in the WTO than developed countries. But at the same time, of course, the rich countries ensured that their corporate agenda would be there by ensuring that there would be what they call market access negotiations on goods, on just stuff that we buy, and on services, and on agriculture, and on all the other issues. And so when we say the word market access, that's a term that actually refers to the lowering of tariffs. So when you say you want to get market access in a country, it means you want that country to lower their tariffs and their non-tariff barriers so that your companies can sell more in that country. So that's referred to the market access negotiations. So, throughout the Doha round, then there's this tension between the developing countries that have been trying to advance development agenda and get more flexibilities with the special and differential treatment proposals versus the corporations driving the agenda promoted by mostly by the rich countries that is for further liberalization. So this tension is there throughout the negotiations since 2001. So I'll try to be a little quicker with the other ministerials. Many of you might remember the Cancun ministerial in 2003. That was a very big fight. It was held in Mexico. There were very big farmer protests. One Korean farmer, Lee Kyung-hae, actually sacrificed himself. He stabbed himself to death to protest the negative impact of the WTO policies on farmers. There was at that ministerial an achievement, though, by developing countries, which is that they, working together with the Our World Is Not for Sale civil society network, got what I mentioned earlier as the Singapore issues kicked out of the Doha round. So as long as the Doha round is being negotiated, 3 of the 4 Singapore issues are not allowed to be on the agenda. The ministerial ended up falling apart, though. They didn't really, move forward with concluding any aspects. But that was an important moment in the history, and partially it was important because it was the first time that there was actually a developing country coalition across regions, okay? So there had been like an Africa group and different groups based in different regions, but that was the first time, and it's called the G20. It's different than the G20 you hear about that has to do with the financial crisis and all that, but that is a developing countries sort of flexing their muscles a little bit in the 2003 ministerial. There was another ministerial in Hong Kong in 2005, and that was a ministerial where we saw the emergence of the Latin American left really try to resist a lot of the expansion agenda in the WTO. So Cuba and Venezuela and some of the other countries really put up a big fight, and they actually objected to the final agreement, and this is supposed to be a consensus organization where all the members have an equal say, but they objected to it, and it was just actually they were just given a footnote in the agreement rather than being able to stop the agreement like the United States can whenever it wants. At that point, there was a large, afterwards, a lot of focus on building social movements, and particularly focus on agriculture and NAMA with the trade unions internationally around these issues. After that, they sort of went to a strategy of having mini ministerials, so they would just have, they would not call all the ministers in because they wanted to exclude certain countries, and they didn't have it on the regular ministerial schedule, which is always December of the odd years, to be, not correspond to the U.S. electoral calendar. But they had many ministerials in 2006 and 2008, and they actually also fell apart. They did not conclude. And I can tell you from the 2008 ministerial, it was a very strange experience because at one point, it all came down to 4 countries. It was a negotiation between the U.S., EU, India, and Brazil. And the U.S. and EU and Brazil had all agreed to the final deal. India was wavering. It wasn't sure. And the U.S. actually went back to the hotel where the corporations were staying during the mini-ministerial and got the message from the corporations that it wasn't actually enough for them. So they resisted and put up a fight and said no. In any case, trying to move quickly here, they did start negotiating afterwards on what's called trade facilitation, which is an agreement that they have now in WTO, and that is about rules like how long a ship can stay in a port before you actually have to have it unloaded. And this agreement was actually pushed through in 2013 at the ministerial in Bali in Indonesia. At the same time, there was a big effort by developing countries to have an agreement on something called public stockholding for food security. So really quickly on that, the agriculture rules that were developed are actually grossly unfair in the WTO. They actually allow countries to subsidize at the rate at which you were subsidizing when you started, when the WTO came into being or when you joined it. And for most developing countries, they weren't actually doing any subsidies of agriculture or very, very minimal at that time, mostly because of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank wouldn't let them or they didn't have the money. But the subsidies in the EU and the United States and some other developed countries are quite large, actually in the tens and hundreds of billions. And so what that means in effect is that developing countries are not able to subsidize their agriculture, even if it's for domestic food production, for domestic consumption by poor people. And so they had a proposal in 2013 to actually change those rules to allow developing countries to do what's considered a best practice in the world, which is to have a little bit of food reserve to help deal with the price volatility and also to make sure that farmers can get a decent price for their food when they produce it, but also to make sure that poor people have good access to subsidized food for food security. So this, unfortunately, has been blocked since 2013 by the United States and a few other countries. It's really unfortunate because it's also in contradiction, actually, to the U.S. stated policy on food security. But that's a whole other story. So that was the 2013 ministerial. They actually did conclude for the first time an agreement in the WTO on trade, which was the trade facilitation deal. It was, touted as something beneficial for developing countries, but it's actually a proposal that the developed countries had put forward and lobbied really hard on. And the developing countries then got what's called a peace clause. This was their exchange, was instead of actually agreeing to allow developing countries to do public stockholding for food security, they said, well, we won't sue you for a couple of years until we find a permanent solution. So they're not allowed to bring cases against the developing countries, but only if they satisfy some pretty onerous conditionalities that are too detailed for us to go into now. But I've written a lot about it. In terms of the current situation, then many countries have actually now ratified the trade facilitation agreement. It has not come into effect yet because 2/3 of the membership actually have to ratify it before it comes into effect. That is the rule on the implementation. There is a big fight happening still in the WTO on the permanent solution for public stockholding for food security. And in fact, in the United States, two letters were written last year by a lot of the development groups and food security groups that care about global hunger, saying that this does not make sense, that we advocate for our own food security programs. 47 million people in the United States benefit from the Supplemental Nutrition Program, which we very much defend, and they, on average, receive about $2,200 per year. India is trying to provide 800 million people, so 2 to 3 times the population of the United States, with some supplemental food, and it would be an average of about $17 a year per person. But their program is actually considered WTO illegal because why? Because they purchase the food directly from poor farmers rather than just purchasing it from corporations or through a market or, in Walmart or whatever. So because actually India is trying to reduce poverty on both sides of the equation, poverty among the consumers, but also among the farmers, who are some of the most poorest people, then their program is considered illegal under the WTO. So that is a big program that we have, and there's also about a dozen different African countries that have this type of food security program. Countries like Nepal and Bangladesh actually have them, but they potentially could be subject to a dispute settlement in the WTO because of these programs. So that's why within the movements working on this issue, we have a big campaign to remove WTO obstacles from food security so that the countries can actually invest in domestic agricultural production It's a whole other, issue to get into with agriculture, but it is generally considered something that has been underinvested in developing countries for the last 20 years, that there's been an emphasis on disinvestment in the agricultural sector. We actually need more investment in agriculture. It's something that's across, for example, you might be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals that talk at least 4 times about the importance of in investing in developing country agriculture. Unfortunately, most countries are not allowed to under WTO rules. So this is one of the major things that we're trying to change as the movement's working on WTO, is to allow countries to invest in their food security. There was some progress. So there was a ministerial in Nairobi in December, and the outcome of it is that they just sort of punted on the food security issue. They did not take any decision, just to say that they're going to try to come to a decision by the next ministerial in 2 years. There was some progress on agriculture, disciplining the subsidies that are considered under one category, that's called export competition, but not disciplining subsidies in the majority of categories which are the subsidies that countries actually use. And again, just for comparison, in the U.S., we have about $134 billion in domestic supports, and those are actually allowed under WTO. And India, with a population, 3 times ours, has $51 billion, but those could be considered WTO illegal, except for the peace clause. Anyhow, it just gives you an idea of some of the great injustices in the North-South issue. There's also a big fight on what I referred to earlier of the implementation agenda, so-called special and differential treatment. A lot of these have to do with developing countries trying to move up the ladder of development. So rather than staying at the bottom of the global value chain and just exporting raw materials, they want to have industrialization policies. They want to create jobs. They want to have a manufacturing base. And a lot of these this issue of the special and differential treatment agenda was actually not moved forward at all. There was no decision taken in the Nairobi ministerial, even though developing countries had put a lot of work into a whole series of 25 proposals on the issue. Not one was agreed to at the Nairobi ministerial. The big issue, however, of coming out of the Nairobi ministerial is actually that for the last 2 or 3 years, the U.S. has been, in contravention to its policy for many years beforehand, pushing to have the Doha round actually declared over and to be abandoned and suspended. And that is because there's a position within the USTR that they do not want to have to treat countries like India and China and Brazil as developing countries, even though they, certainly India and China, I think each have more poor people than all of Africa does. But they don't want to treat them as developing countries because they do have some corporations that are sort of world-class competitors for many U.S. firms. And so they don't want to make any concession that would be given to any of these big, what they call emerging markets. And so the U.S. then has been advocating that the Doha round be suspended. And this was the big fight in Nairobi, actually, was, are we going to abandon the Doha round? Now, consider from civil society, we've been saying no Doha round for, 15 years, and suddenly it's a big change where we now refer to what we call the turnaround agenda. So instead of actually saying whether or not we're in favor or against the Doha round, which you can imagine if your main opponent, who has been pushing the Doha round all this year, now says that they don't want it anymore, you don't want to fall into the trap of having the same position as they do. So we sort of sidestep that and say, well, we want a turnaround of the agenda. And then we have a very specific, detailed list of policy changes that are demanded by civil society that have been endorsed by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations, called the turnaround agenda, that details the immediate changes that need to happen to WTO to limit and reduce the massive harm that it's causing around the world, particularly to farmers, but also, workers, the environment, everybody. And also some of the transformations that would need to happen to the global trading system in general, going beyond just fixing the WTO. That's not really the answer. You'd need to actually transform the entire global trading system into one that actually has as its goal making sure that countries could use trade for their prosperity and development, rather than the institution of the WTO that says trade is first and then doesn't actually evaluate whether or not people and the planet are better off with the particular trade rules that they have. So this goes back to something I'm sure you've talked about many times on this call, which is that it's not trade that's the problem, it's a specific set of rules in the WTO that is actually the problem that we have. So it's not just trade, it's the specific set of WTO rules. So now there's going to be a big fight in Geneva over whether or not the ministerial declaration actually says that they're not going to talk about Doha or not. The ministerial declaration actually says that some countries want Doha to be abandoned, but most countries still want to be negotiating the Doha mandate. And, you know, to be clear, it's the development mandate that they want negotiated. It's not just the market access expansion stuff for corporations. But the U.S. has been arguing that that Doha is now not going to be around anymore, and so it can bring in the new issues. As you remember before, I mentioned that the achievement from Cancun was that as long as the Doha round's being negotiated, then you can't actually negotiate the new issues. So they're going to try now to bring back issues like investment, government procurement, competition policy, and also then use that as a way to discuss other issues in the WTO related to global value chains, bringing back the services negotiations, and so forth. So that is going to be the big fight. Rather than talking about a development agenda and food security, the U.S. and other countries, you know, Australia, Japan, Canada, well, we'll see how their position might change, but definitely the EU pushing to have these other issues. And as I mentioned them, you probably noticed that many of the issues that I mentioned are similar to what's actually part and parcel of the bilateral agreements that have been negotiated. So in terms of then wrapping up the WTO part, in terms of the negotiations, the global picture, you know, is, I mean, partially because the WTO negotiations have stalled, then the strategy that they're using is to negotiate what's called the mega regionals on one side, so the TPP that you guys fight every day, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, on one hand, and then on the other hand, they're doing the sectoral agreements, what we call plurilaterals, and that includes the Trade and Services Agreement, the TiSA, the network that I facilitate, Our World Is Not for Sale, also runs the global campaign against the Trade and Services Agreement, together with the Global Union Federation of Public Services International. So we're also fighting hard against that. And then it also includes things like the Environmental Goods Agreement, the EGA, and the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement. So you can see that they are using this policy of what they call competitive liberalization. So it's not so much that, you know, Doha stalled, therefore they're doing bilaterals. They just do them all the time. And as you know, as corporations have seen that they weren't getting what they wanted out of an expansion of the WTO, then they're doing the mega regionals. Now that they've got the mega regionals and the bilateral investment deals that include all these new issues, now they're trying to bring those new issues back into the WTO so that they can then spread them across, you know, 160 countries at once, 162 countries at once. So that is a big problem for us that we're facing, is the reintroduction of many of those issues into the WTO. I think we're probably running short on time, so I don't know how much people want me to go into some of the cases, but maybe just a couple. I'll mention a couple of them. There was an important...
Deborah,
yes.
Deborah, we are going to have you back, maybe for like 3 calls to go through everything that you know. What I want to do is our folks from Peru, we finally got them on the line, and I would really like to get our Peruvian visitors on because they want to ask us to join them in solidarity. So I want to bring them on, and then I'll do a Q&A with all of you together.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you can help me, listen to me. I'm Gabriela from Peru. Can you hear me?
We hear you, yes. Hello, Gabriela.
Hi, well, my English is not that good, but I will try to communicate our feelings. Well, I'm Gabriela Delgado and Mili Chiri. We are from Peru. We are activists on Peruanos contra el TPP. And Las Zonas is a group of young people that we start to know each other because they was in 2014. There was a law of the government put on young people, like exploiting us, and then we start to mobilization, and we know each other, and now we're very connected with the problems on Peru, on environment and healthy, and a lot of the problems they are here. So when we found about the TPP, we start to promote it, events, and try to talk about it to the people on the street. And we only have the Facebook page because we don't have any help of the medium on TV or nothing, because this year we're going to elect a new president, so that's not the TTP is not a problem right now. And actually, a lot of the people who want to be the president are like, they love the TPP, so we only have the Facebook page to tell the people what's happening here. The first mobilization we have was on December 18, and was only in Lima, is the capital of Peru. And we are like 500 young people walking in the street, stopping traffic with informative posters, and we giving informative flyers to the people on the street. And then the second mobilization was in January 8th, and also 4 cities in Peru are participated too, one in the jungle, Ucayali, Tacna, Chiclayo, and Arequipa. And between mobilizations, we do informative actions, like we have posters in the street, and we talk to people what happened with the TPP, which is a treatment in secret, and they listen to us, and they looking for us in the Facebook page, and this is basically how we start the contact with the people. No, we talk in parks, in hospitals, in public transportation like bus stops, and a lot of things. And then the third mobilization will be on January 22, because the page against TPP in Chile, they write us, they send us an inbox, and they tell us that they will go on the streets on the 22 January. So we are do it too. And also Argentina is going. Also, Argentina is not a country that is into the TPP, but they mobilization against Monsanto, so they will do it too. And then the fourth mobilization will be on February 4. We hear that USA will do it too. So we're really excited that we are finally fighting together, and we had a lot of activities. We invite a lot of young people that we start to painting the material. We have costumes, and we have to bring a lot of art and creative. So this for the young people, that's what we have to do. We don't have money, so we use our creative. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Gabriela, your English was wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, what we're going to do now is we are going to set up for our Q&A with Deborah James. And again, if you want to ask questions, and Adam, I know you've got a question. Anyone with questions, star 6. Adam was already in the queue. Adam, go ahead. Adam?
You know what?
Adam.
I muted myself when I was trying to unmute. Sorry about that. Okay, so first of all, just as a follow-up point to Gabriela, I just wanted to say for anyone who is inspired by her presentation and is interested in doing solidarity actions on the 22nd during their day of action in Peru, it would be great to have solidarity actions at Peruvian and Chilean consulates and at the embassy. If anyone would like to be in touch with Gabriela to find out how you can do that, you can, of course, message her in the chat box, or if she's in the chat box, or you can send an email to me, and I will be happy to put you in touch. My email is adam@tradejustice.net. I know we're possibly talking about doing an action in New York, and it would be great to have solidarity actions in other cities as well. But my question for Deborah, so one of the one of the things that we, in telling people about this call, really promoted was the idea that that the WTO is still a current issue because of some of the cases that have been happening in just recent months. And so we talked a lot about the cool case and about the dolphin tuna case. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about those two cases, really just let people know from the beginning what those cases are about, what the rulings signify, and why we should be concerned.
Yes, thank you for the question, Adam. So the country of origin labeling is a case where Canada and Mexico filed a case against the United States because we have a rule that meat distributors, like a retail operation for meat, has to have a label that includes where the meat was slaughtered, where it was raised, where it was slaughtered, and where it was packaged. And the Mexico and Canada took the U.S. to dispute settlement on this in the WTO because they said that having the label, which is just providing consumer information, again, it's not saying that, we're not going to import your meat. It's just giving consumers information about where the meat was produced, that creates then an unfair bias in the consumers where they prefer U.S. meat, and therefore it's discriminatory against Mexico and Canadian meat. And this case has dragged on for quite a long time in the WTO, and for the very last time that it could ever be appealed, one last time, Mexico and Canada won just recently. And as a result of that, our Congress actually just recently passed a law changing our domestic law, which amazingly enough, it happened right after Obama has been saying that the TPP will never infringe upon domestic lawmaking in the United States, and it will never constrain public health or safety or public interest regulation. And here it was where the WTO had just ruled again that a consumer protection labeling law to provide consumers information was WTO illegal. And in fact, the WTO authorized Canada and Mexico to retaliate in terms of putting trade sanctions on us. We instead changed our rules so that they're not going to do that. The dolphin tuna case is very similar. There was a big movement in the United States to protect dolphins who were getting caught in nets that are used by these big boats that are trawling for tuna. Mexico filed a case against the U.S. and the WTO ruled in favor of Mexico. And again, this was not about whether or not we wanted to ban imports of dolphin-killing tuna, of tuna that was killed that was caught in a dolphin-killing way. This was just about having a label on the tuna that said that no dolphins were killed in the capturing of the tuna. And so we lost that one too. And so we will be, we no longer now are allowed to have the little labels that say that flipper wasn't killed. So this just goes to the fact that in the overwhelming majority of cases that are brought in the WTO, and WTO has a very different adjudication mechanism for disputes than what you're familiar with from TPP, because we don't actually have investor to state. It's always countries bringing cases against countries in the WTO. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, the complainant, the country that's complaining, actually wins. And in fact, there have been 44 cases. There's been 501 cases altogether in WTO, 501. And in 44 of them, countries tried to use something called a general exception. That's like saying, well, we had to have this regulation for public interest, health, safety, whatever it was. And only one time ever did that succeed in defending a public interest policy. And these are the same exceptions that Obama and everybody is saying, the TPP proponents are saying, don't worry about your public health and safety and everything, because we have these exceptions that allow you to protect public health and public interest, safety, workers, the environment. And, obviously that's not the case. If only one case out of 44 was that actually allowed to defend a country's policies in the WTO. So, it's just important to keep in mind with the WTO that, even though you never hear about the negotiations in the media anymore, it is still the game in town that is setting the rules of global trade for 162 countries. And all of the other mega regionals and plurilaterals are trying to be more neoliberal than WTO, of course, by definition. if you already have the WTO, so you can't go back from that. But there is a lot still of countries doing cases against each other, and it is still, countries still have to abide by those rules, whether or not we are able to stop, further expansion of that bad model of the neoliberal agenda. And I just have to highlight, because you're interested in the cases, one small other thing. Well, it's not small. It's that in the WTO, you have to keep in mind that oil is not in the WTO, okay? So oil, countries are allowed to give whatever subsidies for oil they want to oil companies. Renewable energy, however, is disciplined under WTO. So the United States has a case against India for local content requirements and subsidies in the solar industry, even though all the environmental groups in the United States have, know that India needs to have a thriving solar business and to move off of coal, where tens of thousands of people die actually in India every year because of coal for energy, that they need to move to solar. We just had this big Paris deal. All countries need to contribute to, getting us off of fossil fuels and to having a renewable energy future. And yet within the WTO, countries are doing cases against each other for, Canada lost a case. The U.S. Is, being threatened with being taken a case over renewable energy subsidies. So it's a big problem right now that we have these rules where fossil fuel subsidies are excluded from WTO, but the renewable energy that we all need for the planet to survive, and certainly for humans to survive on the planet, are actually restricted under the current WTO rules. So it's a really big problem for climate change and renewable energy for our future.
Thank you, Deborah. A lot of our folks are dropping off. As you probably know, tonight is the night of the Democratic debate. So we are going to invite you back because there was so much information. And again, I'm going to remind everybody that is still on the call, we recorded this. So you will not have to miss a word. And Deborah James, her talking points, we are already posting them on all of our download sites. So you will be able to get this information. I have nobody left in my call queue. So Adam, can you go ahead and give us our future calls, and let's begin to close this out for tonight.
Sure can. Thank you. So just a note, as Andrea just mentioned, the Democratic debate is just starting. This is a great opportunity for us to help spread the word about TPP by going on Twitter, watching the debate, and live tweeting the debate using the debate hashtag and posting out messages about how the issues that the candidates are talking about intersect with the impacts that TPP will have on our lives. We've done this before for other debates, and it's a great way to keep spreading the word. So moving on to next week's call. Our special guest will be Sharon England-Treat, who is a former Maine state legislator and an expert on destructive trade deals. She's written a great deal on issues like regulatory cooperation. She's an expert on water rights issues and environmental impacts, and the impact that these destructive trade deals have on the ability of our state and local legislators to pass public interest policies in that are in our interest, but not necessarily the interest of corporate profits. So she's going to be our special featured speaker. She's going to be talking about regulatory cooperation in TTIP and regulatory coherence in TPP, which will lead to the creation of new bureaucracy in the interest of undermining our ability to pass public interest policies. She may also be talking about some of the broader issues about TPP's impact on food safety and the environment, and on how TPP undermines democracy and interferes with the ability of local elected officials to pass the laws that we, or the people, actually want and need, but that international corporations may not like as much. So that's Sharon England-Treat this coming Sunday. You can follow the registration link to sign up now, and go to the additional details link to RSVP on Facebook, and then share and invite with others. Please RSVP at both those so we can be sure to send you the call login details. And please come again next Sunday next week, and thanks a lot, everyone.
And thank you, Adam. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, Margaret Flowers. Thank you to our wonderful, wonderful activist forum from Peru. Thank you to our very, very special guest, Deborah James. Thank you, Liz Warren. And I am going to turn off the
Your
recording.
conference recording has stopped. Q&A session is over.
And I thank everyone.
Night,
Good
everyone.
night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.
The link will be in 5 minutes.
Everybody. Good night. Everyone will be great to call everyone.
Goodbye.